Elvis was a very special person. He never turned no one down that was in need. He was a loving and caring person for everyone that he came in contact with, and most everyone loved him.
There is a bedroom at Graceland that tourists walked past for 11 years without ever knowing what was behind the door. No velvet rope explained it. No plaque marked it. Guides simply steered the crowd toward the kitchen and kept moving, because on the other side of that wall, a woman was still living her actual life while thousands of strangers toured the house around her. Her name was Delta Mae Presley Biggs, and by the time she died in 1993, she was the last member of the Presley family still calling Graceland home. What she watched unfold inside those walls, across nearly 3 decades, has quietly become one of the most human stories connected to Elvis Presley's life, and it has almost nothing to do with scandal. To understand who Delta was, you have to go back before Graceland even existed as an idea. She was born Delta Mae Presley, one of Vernon Presley's sisters, which made her Elvis's aunt on his father's side. She married a man named Eugene Pat Biggs in 1940, and for years she lived an unremarkable life far outside the spotlight that would eventually swallow her nephew whole. She and Pat never had children. She was not famous, not photographed, not written about. She was just a Mississippi-born woman married to her husband, living quietly while, a few counties away, her nephew was becoming the most talked-about entertainer on the planet. Everything shifted when Pat Biggs died in the mid-1960s. Delta found herself widowed, without children, and without the life she had built for over 2 decades. Grief has a way of redrawing the map of a person's world, and for Delta, the map pointed home, to family, to the Presleys, and specifically to the sprawling estate her nephew had bought a decade earlier. In 1967, she moved into Graceland. It was not framed as a historic decision at the time. No one announced it. It was simply a widow moving in with relatives, the same quiet arrangement countless families have made for generations. The difference was that this particular household happened to include the biggest star in the world. When Delta arrived, she joined a home that already included Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Mae, who had been living there since the family first moved in back in 1957. This was not yet the polished, roped-off museum visitors know today. It was still simply a house, a large and unusual one, where an ordinary Mississippi family was trying to hold itself together while one of its members turned into a global phenomenon. Delta wasn't reading about Elvis's career from a distance. She was living under the same roof during the peak of Beatlemania, through his years making Hollywood films, through his television comeback, and into the Las Vegas residency era that defined the final stretch of his life. She experienced his career the way a family member experiences a family member, not as headlines but as the person who showed up, or didn't, for dinner. Elvis was famously generous with the people who stayed close to him, and Delta was one of the relatives who benefited from that loyalty. This isn't some rumor stitched together after his death. It's one of the most consistently repeated details from nearly everyone who actually knew him personally. He kept family near, he housed relatives who needed somewhere to land, and he built a significant part of his life around looking after the people who had known him before fame ever entered the picture. Delta had shelter, she had family around her, and she had a front-row seat to a kind of life most people only imagine from a distance. But a mansion full of family members living alongside a global superstar isn't automatically peaceful. The very thing that made Graceland extraordinary, housing the most famous entertainer in the world, also made it a pressure cooker. Fans gathered at the gates constantly. The demands on Elvis's time never let up. Everyone who lived close to him absorbed some version of that strain, whether they had asked for it or not. Family members who spent time around Delta later described her as someone with a sharp tongue, a strong personality, and very little patience for people she felt were only around Elvis for what they could get out of him. She wasn't shy about saying so, either, which made her a memorable presence at a house full of people who often were. That contrast, warmth on one side and mounting pressure on the other, defines much of what people who actually lived at Graceland have described over the years. There was Elvis the family man, generous and protective of the relatives who depended on him, and there was Elvis increasingly boxed in by his own fame, wearing down under scrutiny and the exhausting machinery of being a public figure every hour of every day. Delta lived close enough to see both versions. She wasn't a fan outside the gates. She was family, sharing meals and ordinary household rhythms with a relative who also happened to be the most recognized man alive. Then, on August 16, 1977, that chapter ended abruptly. Elvis died at Graceland at the age of 42, a fact confirmed by medical examiners and reported worldwide within hours. It remains one of the most documented events in modern music history. The house Elvis had built specifically to hold his family together would never again be simply a family home. Graceland didn't empty out all at once after Elvis's death. It emptied slowly, and Delta watched nearly every stage of it happen. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, died 2 years later, in 1979. Minnie May, the grandmother who had shared the house with Delta for over a decade, passed away in 1980. One by one, the people who had filled Graceland with noise, arguments, and family history were gone. The bedrooms emptied. The dinner table grew quieter. A house that had once buzzed with an entire extended family started to feel like an echo of what it used to be. That left Delta essentially alone in a mansion built for a legend, holding on to a home that increasingly belonged more to the public imagination than to her actual family. Every other person who had once shared that roof with her was gone, and yet she stayed, walking the same halls while the estate itself was quietly reshaped into something else entirely. In 1982, Priscilla Presley made the decision to open Graceland to visitors. It was part business decision and part preservation effort, and in many ways it was inevitable. A home this culturally significant couldn't simply sit closed up and decaying while the estate figured out its future. On opening day, more than 3,000 fans lined up to walk through a house that, until recently, had been entirely private. But turning Graceland into a public attraction also created a strange and deeply personal complication for the one family member who still lived there full-time. Delta's actual bedroom, her kitchen, her daily routine, was about to sit just feet away from a public tour route, and she had no intention of leaving. So an arrangement was worked out. Delta kept her bedroom, tucked just off the kitchen, away from the path tour groups would walk. That room, along with the kitchen surrounding it, stayed off the public tour for years, carved out specifically so she could go on living the way she always had, even while thousands of strangers moved through the rest of the house every single day. This is where Delta stops being a historical footnote and becomes genuinely interesting. During the day, Graceland ran like a well-oiled operation, with tour groups guided past the white staircase, the dining room, and the piano room on a tight schedule. And just a few feet away, behind a closed door near the kitchen, an older woman with a small dog named Edmund lived her real, unglamorous life, close enough to hear the footsteps of strangers touring what used to be simply her home. Edmund had actually been a gift from Elvis himself, and according to family members, Delta came to think of the dog as her closest companion after losing her husband, her brother Vernon, and eventually Elvis and Minnie May as well. By most family accounts, Delta had little patience for being treated like part of the attraction. She was known to be blunt, occasionally sharp-tempered, and not particularly interested in performing for an audience of curious tourists. When visitors sometimes spotted her walking Edmund around the grounds and asked whether she was Aunt Delta, she would reportedly wave them off entirely, telling them Delta had passed away the night before. It's a detail that has circulated through family retellings for years, less a headline-worthy scandal and more a glimpse of a woman who had simply grown tired of being treated as a living exhibit inside her own house. At night, once the last tour group filed out and the doors locked, something different happened. Delta had the run of the entire mansion to herself. According to people who worked at Graceland over the years, she would sometimes quietly rearrange small elements of the house during those after-hours stretches, modest acts of ownership over a space that legally belonged to an estate but had once simply been hers. That instinct even factored into a conversation she reportedly had with Graceland's first chief executive, Jack Soden, while the estate was preparing to open to the public in the early 1980s. As the team discussed whether to preserve the bold red decor Elvis had installed in his final years, Delta reportedly told Soden that Elvis had actually grown tired of that color scheme himself, and that he had started using the back staircase specifically to avoid walking past it. She pointed him toward the softer blue and white furnishings still sitting in storage, the ones Elvis had originally preferred. That conversation is widely credited with shaping how several rooms look to this day. It's a small detail, but a telling one. Delta wasn't just living inside a museum piece. She still saw the house as a home worth having an opinion about. A lot of the more sensational retellings of Delta's story online claim she exposed some hidden scandal about Elvis, some secret nobody else knew, some cover-up finally coming to light. The documented reality is both less dramatic and, honestly, more compelling. Delta's real legacy isn't a bombshell revelation. It's a first-hand, decades-long perspective on what it actually looked like to be related to Elvis Presley while the rest of the world was busy turning him into a myth. She didn't need to expose some hidden crime, because the truth she carried was simpler and more human. Elvis was generous with the people he loved, he kept his family close even as fame pulled him further from an ordinary existence, and the pressure of being Elvis Presley around the clock took a visible toll on the people living closest to him, Delta included. That's not a small story, even if it doesn't fit into a single dramatic headline. It's the story of a family trying to hold on to something resembling normal life inside a house the entire world wanted a piece of. It's the story of a widow who lost her husband, moved into her nephew's mansion for stability and companionship, and ended up spending the rest of her life as the last living connection between Graceland the family home and Graceland the international landmark. Delta also represented something increasingly rare inside Elvis's orbit, a relationship with him that existed long before the records, the screaming crowds, and the Hollywood contracts. She had known the Presleys before they became American royalty, and that gave her a perspective nobody else in his adult life really carried. She wasn't trying to protect a brand or manage a public image. She simply remembered the boy she'd watched grow into a phenomenon. In many ways, her quiet presence is a reminder that history isn't only preserved through interviews and archived newspaper clippings. Sometimes it's preserved by the people who stayed in the background, watching everything unfold from the next room, for years at a time. It's worth sitting with how unusual that vantage point actually was. Nearly everyone who has ever written or spoken about Elvis Presley has done so from the outside, looking in. Biographers piecing things together from interviews, fans working from concert footage, historians relying on old newspaper archives. Delta didn't need any of that distance. She simply lived there, through the highs, through the death of the man who made the house famous, and through its transformation into one of the most visited private residences in America. Her perspective wasn't secondhand. It was lived, day after day, inside those same four walls. When Delta passed away in July of 1993, something shifted almost immediately. Her bedroom, the one space tourists had never been permitted to see, was eventually restored to reflect how it looked when Elvis's parents originally used it, and the kitchen was added to the public tour route the following year. The last real barrier between home and museum quietly dissolved around the same time she did, as though the house itself had been waiting for her to finish living in it before it could fully complete its transformation into something else. There's a strange kind of poetry in that timing. For the 26 years Delta lived there, one small, private corner of Graceland stayed exactly what it had always been, somebody's actual home. The moment that changed was the moment she was no longer there to occupy it. Delta Biggs never gave a tell-all interview. She never sat down promising to reveal Elvis's darkest secrets, and she never needed to. What she left behind instead was quieter and, in a lot of ways, more meaningful, proof that even inside the most famous house in America, someone was still simply trying to live an ordinary life. Maybe that's the real truth behind Graceland's last resident. Not a scandal, not a hidden conspiracy, but a reminder that behind every legend there's still a family, still a house, and still someone who has to be the one to turn off the lights at night. Millions of people have walked through Graceland's doors since it opened to the public in 1982. They've stood in the jungle room, looked up at the gold records lining the hallway, and paused quietly in the meditation garden where Elvis rests alongside his parents and grandmother. Almost none of them ever realized that for 11 of those years, someone was still living just a few feet from the velvet ropes, finishing out an entire life inside a house the rest of the world had already turned into a monument. That's the part of Delta's story that tends to get lost in the noise. Not a secret, not a scandal, just a woman who buried her husband, moved in with family, watched a nephew become a legend, watched him die far too young, and then quietly held on to the last unclaimed corner of his childhood home until there was nothing left to hold on to.